Good afternoon. Warm welcome to everyone. Very warm welcome to Professor Upinder Singh for being here this afternoon for the School of Social Sciences IOE Golden Jubilee distinguished lectures. The three lectures left, including the one today, in the first series. So I'm sure that by the time the series is over, somebody is going to throw something at me for saying this yet again, that I am immensely, and I mean it seriously, proud that the School of Social Sciences for the last 50 years has stood for truth, courage, knowledge, conversation, wisdom, all those things which make a university credible, which make a university visible, and which make a university worth the nomenclature of a university. So I'm immensely proud to welcome you all on behalf of the School of Social Sciences. Very warm welcome to all the guests. I see a lot of guests this afternoon who are here. Very warm welcome to everyone. And now I request Professor Suchandra Ghosh to introduce the speaker and chair the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Jyotirmaya Sharma, Professor Upinder Singh, Professor Jyotirmaya Sharma, Professor Vijaya Ramdas, colleagues, senior colleagues, guests, and my dear students. It is a privilege and honor for me to introduce Professor Upinder Singh, who is undoubtedly one of the finest historians of our times. Professor Singh is Professor of History at Ashoka University, Sonipat. She studied in St. Stephen's College for her BA Honours degree and obtained her MA and MPhil in Honours from the University of Delhi. She obtained her PhD degree from McGill University, Montreal. She taught in St. Stephen's College and the History Department of the University of Delhi before moving to Ashoka University. You all are aware of her wide range of works, and she has interests over various aspects of ancient Indian history and archaeology, the history of ideas, and Indians' interaction with the wider world. She is the author of many books, and her research papers have been published in Indian and international journals. And some of the papers are extremely seminal to our understanding of early Indian history. She is also the author of Kings, Brahmanas, and Temples in Orissa, an epigraphic study. Then Ancient Delhi. There's a series, The Discovery of Ancient India, Early Archaeologists and Beginnings of Archaeology, A History of Ancient and Early Medieval India from the Stone Age to the 12th century. And I know that here the students, each one of you, how you value this book, and the new edition has also come. Then we have Political Violence in India, Ancient India, and Ancient India, Culture of Contradictions. She has edited Delhi, Ancient History, Rethinking Early Medieval India, and has co-edited Ancient India, New Research. Ancient Encounters, Exploring Connected Histories, Buddhism in Asia, Revival and Reinvention, The World of India's First Archaeologist, Letters from Alexander Cunningham to J.D.M. Begler. These are one of the three of her most recent works where she had edited. Her other publications, recent and which I just mentioned, one is her revised editions of her collection of essays, the Idea of Ancient India, and other is the famous, the panoramic work, A History of Ancient and Early Medieval India. Professor Singh has also been a recipient of a number of fellowships. To mention a few, she was the recipient of the Netherlands Governmental Reciprocal Fellowship, Ancient India and Iran Trust, Charles Wellis India Visiting Fellowship, Daniel Ingalls Fellowship at the Harvard Enching Institute, and Erasmus Mundus Fellowship at the University of Leuven. She was also I'm very proud to say that she was also awarded the Infosys Award for Social Sciences History in 2009. At the end, I must add that I first met her in 2008 in a conference. Since then, there were many occasions to meet, to share platforms with her, to work together. And what I felt then, And what I feel now remains the same. Professor Singh epitomizes scholarship, modesty, and dignity. I now welcome her to give her talk.
Thank you very much, Professor Suchandra Ghosh, for that very generous introduction. I would like to thank Professor Jyotirmaya Sharma, Dean of the School of Social Sciences, of course, Professor Suchandra Ghosh, and Head of the History Department, and all members of the History Department for inviting me to deliver one of the School of Social Sciences in IOE Golden Jubilee Distinguished Lectures. I'm really happy also to see so many students here. It really warms my heart, and it's so good to meet old friends, some whom I've not met for many, many decades. So thank you so much for giving me the honor of inviting me here today. My talk today emphasizes the importance of the history of ideas in general and the fact that political ideas are a very important part of political history. In my book, Political Violence in Ancient India, I suggested that one of the things that distinguishes ancient Indian political thought is its profound engagement with the tension between violence and non-violence. I argued for a connection between the growth and systematization of state violence and increasingly sophisticated attempts to mask, invisibilize, justify, and aestheticize this violence. I also argued that all traditions, including the religions of nonviolence, like Jainism and Buddhism, acknowledged that a certain amount of violence was necessary for kings. In fact, political theorists, poets, and religious thinkers played important roles in crafting and disseminating ideologies that transformed political violence into something acceptable, positive, necessary for the well being of subjects and for the maintenance of the social order. At the same time, ancient Indian political discourse distinguished force that was necessary, proportionate, and legitimate from that which was unnecessary, excessive, and illegitimate, leaving open a window for questioning the state's coercive power. I'm going to take the story on from there by talking about Ashoka and Kautilya, Dhamma or Dharma, Artha, and Artha perspectives on the problem of violence. And what you see on screen is a magnificent sculpture representing Ashoka after the Kalinga War, a magnificent sculpture by the great Indian artist A. Ramachandran. Let me start by talking about Ashoka. Ashoka was never forgotten. He was a legendary great king across the entire Buddhist world. But the epigraphic Ashoka was forgotten and discovered or rediscovered in the 19th century by James Prinsep, who finally cracked Ashokan Brahmi, and then with the help of George Turner, was able to connect the Devanam Piyadasi of the inscriptions with the Mauryan Emperor Ashoka. After that, of course, many Ashokan inscriptions were discovered, were deciphered, and we are able to plot these inscriptions, and historians are very fond of joining the dots between Ashoka's inscriptions and reconstructing the contours of the Maurya Empire, though Maurya control could not have extended in equal measure across this vast area. I will not go into the details of the classification of the inscriptions, but they have been divided into various categories by scholars. What I want to emphasize as I talk about Ashoka and Kautilya is that these are not ancient figures that are part of ancient history alone. They have lived on in modern memory in many important ways. The inscriptions of Ashoka, of course, most of them are in the Brahmi script and the Prakrit language. In the Northwest, we have the use of Greek and Aramaic and the Kharoshti script. Those are details. But looking at modern memories of Ashoka, Of course, you all know that the Sarnath capital forms the central emblem of the symbol, of the emblem of the Indian nation state. And this is one of many pillar capitals, of course, that have been found that are connected with Ashok's message. What you also see on screen is the Vaishali pillar with its rather not so grand single lion. And Ashok's imprint has also been left in many parts of the country in different ways. What you see on screen is the Dhauli elephant, which surmounts a set of the major rock edicts which are below the elephant, and then the Lomash Rishi cave in the Barabar hills. We don't know what Ashok looked like. He only left us his inscriptions, the emblems of power and Dhamma, principally in the form of animals, animal imagery. We do have later images of Ashok. For instance, at Kanganahalli, where I hope to go in a day or two, we have a relief sculpture of Ashok and his consort. And this is one of several images of this king that adorned Buddhist sites several centuries after his time. But unlike political leaders in our own time, Ashok was not interested in having his own likeness, his own physical form represented in stone. He wanted his ideas to be inscribed and to last, as he hoped, forever and ever. So I don't think you would disagree. Ashok has acquired a reputation, a formidable reputation, as an icon of Indian nonviolence, as a great emperor who was an apostle of peace, devoted to the spread of morality and goodness. That's how I understand Dhamma among humankind. And it is this image of Ashok that has lived on, which we see in material form all around us today. Apart from the emblem of the Indian Republic, we find a certain rendering of the Ashokan, idiosyncratic rendering of the Ashokan lions on top of the new Parliament building. And we find what I think Ashok would have been pretty uncomfortable with, that is the war memorial. I think it's quite ironic that an emperor who argued so passionately for non-violence and the renunciation of war, that his lions crown the National War Memorial. So Ashok is well known in modern India. And coming to the Arthashastra, here again, we have a kind of discovery or rediscovery in 1905 when Shama Shastri, the librarian of the Mysore Government Oriental Library, was handed a manuscript. And because he was a learned Pandit, he was able to recognize that this is a very important ancient text. And it was none other than the Arthashastra. I don't want to go into too many details about the stylistic features of the Arthashastra. It is in the sutra style, interspersed with verses. There are 3 overlapping divisions. There are 15 adhikaranas or books, 150 chapters or adhyayas, and 180 topics or prakaranas. But there is a debate about the date of the Arthashastra, and this has been going on for a very, very long time. The traditional view is that the Arthashastra of Kautilya is a work belonging to the Mauryan period, that it was written in the 4th century BCE by a man named Kautilya or Chanakya or Vishnugupta, who became Chandragupta Maurya's principal advisor, something like a chief minister, the brains behind his overthrowing the Nanda dynasty and establishing the Maurya dynasty. So that is the traditional view. But over the decades, and I think today there is, perhaps with some exceptions among Indian scholars, most scholars internationally do agree that the Arthashastra was a post-Maurya work, that it was composed sometime between the 1st century BCE in several stages, between the 1st century BCE and the early centuries CE. It's a brilliant, highly influential work on statecraft. It is a very sophisticated theoretical Shastra. It is a theoretical treatise, a Shastra that is rooted in the practice or prayoga of politics. And the Arthashastra itself tells us that it was part of a very long tradition of scholarship, but it did also make some very significant innovations. It created a new discipline, bringing together politics and economics. It created a new discipline of political economy. And although it had predecessors, it contained a an exceptionally meticulous, methodical, vigorous, and logical method of the treatment of statecraft. And we know who the book was written for, because it tells us it was written for kings. So we can imagine that it was written not only for kings, but also members of the ruling elite. Like Ashok, the Arthashastra has had tremendous impact. Kautilya, the author, has acquired a formidable reputation. He's been described as the Indian Machiavelli, okay, although he came so much before Machiavelli that the description actually should be the other way around. He is known as a proponent of realpolitik for whom the ends justify the means. And for him, the ruthless pursuit of power justifies all kinds of deceit and killing. So this is the reputation that Kautilya has right down to our own time. By the way, he had this reputation in ancient times as well. So it is a continuing reputation that we are looking at. And there are many modern imaginings of Kautilya as well. These are some of the modern imaginings. On one side, you see the Amar Chitra Katha, and you can see there's a certain way in which Chanakya has been imagined as this wily, very crafty Brahman in modern times. And on the other side, you see a still from the television series long before your times. I'm talking about the students, but it was very popular in its time, the series called Chanakya. Kautilya or Chanakya also lives on in many very hot-selling self-help books, particularly in management and entrepreneurship. And apparently these books have sold millions of copies, many more copies than our books sell. And he also adorns a 5 rupee coin that commemorates the income tax department of all things. Okay, so he lives on in many different ways. But the two have very different reputations. I think you would agree that in every respect, Ashoka and Kautilya come across as opposites in terms of their image, in terms of their reputations, in terms of the idea of politics that they represent. Ashoka represents what can be described as the dharma view of politics, though we can discuss whether there is a single dharma view or several. That is open to discussion, but I think he does represent a certain view, ethical view, which we can describe as the dharma view of politics, and Kautilya represents the artha view, where material gain, the pursuit and the acquisition of power, the aggrandizement and politics and political power comes above everything else. But what I want to do is to look a little more closely at Kautilya and Ashok's attitudes towards particularly violence and non-violence. I want to look behind the image and to see what a close reading of the Ashokan inscriptions and also Kautilya's Arthashastra, what it suggests to us, particularly with reference to their understanding of dharma, the issue of capital punishment, war, and the forest people. These are the sub-themes that I want to look at. And you may ask why I am looking at two figures who seem to be so different, so diametrically opposed. But I think that comparing these two figures and their ideas not only helps us get behind the sometimes misleading images that ancient thinkers and individuals have, but I think it may also tell us something significant and interesting about the nature of ancient Indian political thought and practice. So let us first start with the differences. We'll start with the divergence between Ashoka and Kautilya, and there are many differences. I've already mentioned how Ashoka represents the Dharma view of politics and Kautilya the Artha view, and we will try to look beyond the image to the divergence and then the convergence. Well, there is a very big difference in the place of Dharma in their political ideology. For Ashoka, Dharma is supreme. In fact, the word Dhamma is mentioned over 100 times in his inscriptions, and Ashoka was a man who was possessed with the desire to explain and to propagate and to spread the kind of understanding of Dharma or Dhamma that he had, not only within his own kingdom, but beyond his kingdom as well. So he really was obsessed with explaining and propagating Dhamma. So Dhamma is clearly supreme. It's the most important thing for him. And he was so obsessed with Dhamma that I'm sure he had very little patience with the nitty-gritty of the day-to-day activities that would have been involved in governing a vast empire. He would have been very impatient with all those things. Kautilya, on the other hand, says, Artha eva pradhana iti Kautilyaha, Artha mulo hi dharma kamaviti. Artha, material well-being, is superior to dharma, and he explains why. Because he explains things. He doesn't just make statements. There is a kind of logical approach to statecraft here. He says, Artha is superior to dharma and kama, or sensual pleasure, because dharma and kama are dependent on it. So although Kautilya occasionally pays lip service to dharma, it's very clear that he is going to look at, in fact, Arthashastra demands that an expert on Arthashastra must look at politics from the point of view of Artha. So this is one major difference. Dharma has different position. It's right on top in terms of the, call it Purusharthas, it's on top of the scale of everything for Ashoka, and for Kautilya it is Artha. The second difference is in what Dhamma and Dharma are for these two thinkers. So I'm looking at Ashoka as a political thinker, not only as a modern king, because I think there is a political philosophy that is embedded in his inscriptions. And he tells us, we don't have to guess because he tells us not once, but again and again. So for Ashoka, Dhamma, which is the Prakrit form of the Sanskrit Dharma, includes self-control, purity of thought, liberality or generosity, dana, gratitude, firm devotion, truthfulness, and purity. These are some of the virtues that he mentions repeatedly in his edicts, and that's not all. It is a duty-oriented set of ideas. So relations, social relations are extremely important. He tells us that Dhamma also includes obedience to mother and father, respect for elders, courtesy and generosity towards Brahmins and renunciants, Shramanas, courtesy to slaves and servants, which must have been quite revolutionary in the 4th century BCE context. Liberality or generosity towards friends, acquaintances, and relatives, moderation in expenditure and possessions, and guarding one's speech. These are things that are stated in Ashoka's inscriptions, where he describes what Dhamma is, where he explains what Dhamma is. And of course, and we'll talk about this some more, Dhamma also includes and attaches this great deal of importance that is attached in Dhamma to non-violence and compassion. In fact, Patrick Olivelle, in his excellent work on Ashoka and also the concept of Dharma, has suggested quite convincingly that Ashoka, by making Dhamma or Dharma, the cornerstone of his political philosophy, by talking about Dhamma in inscriptions all over the subcontinent, that he actually played a very pivotal role in changing, transforming the meaning of the word Dharma by injecting ethical content into it. So this is Ashok's Dhamma. It has to do with ethics. It has to do with the cultivation of the self. How does this compare with Kautilya's Dharma? It is very clearly a Brahminical perspective. And let me say that, as you well know, Ashoka was influenced by Buddhism, but his Dhamma is not identical to the teaching of the Buddha for the laity. There are overlaps. Kautilya's Dharma, on the other hand, is a very clear Brahminical perspective. And when he talks about Dharma, he has the Dharma Shastra model of Dharma in front of him. It is the Dharma of Varnas and the Dharma of Ashramas. I would say Varna Dharma is more important than Ashrama Dharma. However, and that is something I find quite interesting, that although Kautilya is seen as a Brahmin or Brahminical ideologue on politics, if you read the text carefully, we find that the interests of the state, the profit of the state, the interests of the state are really central, so much so that when Kautilya has to make a break from Varna Dharma, he does so. So he will say, for instance, that you can recruit Shudras in the army. Okay, that would not be in accordance with what a text like the Manusmriti would say. So he makes breaks, significant breaks with the Brahminical tradition when it is the interests of the state that are involved. There is a difference in the placing of Dharma in the two texts, in the thought of the two thinkers. There is a significant difference in the meaning, the content of Dharma in the thought of the two thinkers. And there is, of course, a significant difference in the place of non-violence in the thought of these thinkers. So if you read the Ashokan edicts, he talks about how daya, compassion, gentleness, self-control, sayyama, abstention from injuring, avihimsa, abstention from killing, analambha, how these are very, very important aspects of Dhamma. And clearly, Ashoka comes across as a ruler, as an emperor who was very concerned with mitigating the violence that is inherent or was inherent then in, and still is inherent in the social and political spheres. What about Kautilya? Kautilya also talks about violence. He discusses violence of various kinds, but mitigating social violence does not appear to be an overtly central concern for him. It's there, but it's not as important as it is for Ashoka. What about the attitude towards the relationship between the king and the praja, the subjects? Ashoka does talk about certain welfare measures that he took for the material welfare of his subjects, planting trees, digging wells, providing for medical care, so on and so forth. But it is very clear that he was more concerned with the moral welfare of the people, not only in his own realm, but also beyond his own realm. And the reason why he was concerned, or you can ask the question, how do we know he really thought this? Did he really believe this? That's another question. But this is what he is telling us. So let us just go with that for the time being. And he says that he's concerned about the moral welfare of his people for their own sake, so that they attain happiness in this life and the next, so that they attain punya, that is merit, and so that they attain swarga, or heaven. What about Kautilya? Quite different. His king is concerned with the material welfare of his subjects. And he is concerned with his subjects' material welfare so as to further his own power and resources. In fact, I think Kautilya's most brilliant intervention in Indian political thought is that he was able to demonstrate that furthering the material welfare of the subjects was in the political and material interests of the king. So he does this through logical reasoning, through explanation. So it's really material welfare that he is concerned with. He's not particularly or not overtly concerned with the kind of moral welfare issues and punya that Ashok is interested in. When we talk about nonviolence and Ashok's nonviolence, he is especially connected with an attitude of concern for not only the welfare of human beings but animals. And this is because Ashok sees himself or saw himself or says he saw himself as an emperor of not only a political empire but a moral empire in which all beings, humans and animals, were his subjects, or let us say his constituency. Kautilya, on the other hand, discusses animals quite a bit, as we'll see, but he discusses them largely as private property. And he sees animals as also a valuable economic resource for the state. And there are places where he commodifies various animal body parts which can be sold and bought and sold, so on and so forth. So there seems to be a very different attitude towards animals that we see when we compare Ashoka and Kautilya. Punishment. In Ashok's inscriptions, we hear the king saying that the Rajukas, officers known as the Rajukas, should discharge their duties vis-a-vis the handing out of rewards and punishment fairly and fearlessly. He says there should be samata in judicial proceedings and punishment, and there's debate about whether samata means equality or fairness. So there is this concern for, regarding justice. The connection between the king and justice is strong in both cases, but there is a difference in the attitudes towards justice, because in the Artha Shastra, which also happens to be the earliest expression of a detailed legal code in India, where you have a very detailed discussion of crime and punishment, all humans, all subjects are not considered the same. There is a gradation in the value that is attached to human life on the basis of varna. So varna is central to Kautilya's discussion of punishment. Not only that, inflicting pain, torture, mutilation, amputation is a routine part of punishment in the Arthashastra. And I think Ashok, if he read the Arthashastra, might have felt a little, nauseous at some of the descriptions that are there in the text about different kinds of torture. For instance, though some of these types of torture may seem to be very mild compared to what we know of in the modern world, Kautilya talks about striking, whipping, caning, suspension from a rope, inserting needles under the nails, so on and so forth. But the kind of tenor of the discussion of punishment comes across as rather different from Ashok, who is talking about fairness and is asking the Rajukas to be solicitous and caring in the attitude towards people in general. And as we also know, as many of you know, the principle of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, we also see that applied by Kautilya in some cases. So we're looking at many things that are different. And among the things that are different is the attitude towards war and Dhamma Vijaya. Rock Edict 13 it's a very important inscription that I think everybody should read. It contains a series of arguments against war. It talks not only about the Kalinga War, but also about how war in general is a terrible thing and it affects more than the people who are directly affected. And it expands. In that inscription, Ashok expands on the nature of the injury that is caused by war. And the king announces in that inscription that he has renounced war and urges his successors to do the same. In the same inscription, Ashok puts forward the idea of Dhamma Vijaya, or victory through Dhamma, righteous victory. And this was not a military victory. It consisted in spreading Dhamma. So he clearly saw himself as having achieved or attained Dhamma Vijaya, not only in his own empire, but in the kingdoms, neighboring kingdoms, including the Hellenistic kings who were his contemporaries. What is the attitude towards war in the Arthashastra? The Arthashastra has a lot to say about war. There's a typology of war, Prakasha Yuddha, open war, Kuta Yuddha, which is crooked war, Tushnim Yuddha, silent war, and we can add a fourth type of war, which is diplomatic war. These are the reasons why scholars of international relations really love Kautilya. He's there in the international relations syllabi, political science also. I'm sure there are political science students here. A lot of discussion, a lot of classification of many things, including war. And for Kautilya, there is also a typology of victors. There are three kinds of victors. According to Kautilya, there is the Asura Vijayan, that is the demonic victor, who is only satisfied with the seizure of land and goods and wives and sons and life of the enemy. There is the Lobha Vijayan, who is the greedy victor, who wants to seize the land and goods of the enemy. And then there is the Dharma Vijayan, the righteous victor, who is satisfied with submission. So the term Dharma Vijaya, Dharma Vijayan, is there in both Ashoka and Kautilya, but the meaning that is attached to Dharma Vijaya in Ashoka's inscription is absolutely different from what Dharma Vijaya means in Kautilya's Arthashastra, where it is the best type, the most noble type of military victory. I think just one or two last things in terms of the differences. If you read Ashoka's inscriptions, I think he comes across as a king who is extremely confident, even pompous, even arrogant. So he is very confident, he's not paranoid, he's not insecure. But although the Arthashastra is often seen as a text that justifies totalitarianism, I think it also presents a king who is very vulnerable, and vulnerable in various respects, including vulnerable to assassination. And one of the many things that Kautilya says is that a king can protect his kingdom when he is himself protected from those close to him and from his enemies, first of all, from his wives and sons. And there's a very detailed discussion about how the king must be very, very careful vis-a-vis his women, his queens, his sons. So the king lives in a world of danger, always afraid of being killed. So these are the points of divergence, and you should not be surprised that there are so many points of divergence. But I think what is more interesting, perhaps, is that there are so many different points of convergence between Ashoka and Kautilya. So let me just turn to that now. The aims of the state. This is from Ashoka's Rock Edict 6. He says, "No work is more important than promoting the welfare of all men. And whatever effort I am making is so that I may discharge the debt I owe to all beings, so that I may make them happy in this world and they may attain heaven in the next." So we've already noted that this is a sentiment that runs through many of Ashoka's inscription. But the Arthashastra says something that's not very dissimilar. In the happiness of his subjects lies the happiness of the king, and his welfare, hita, lies in the welfare of his subjects. The king's welfare does not lie in which is pleasing, priya, to himself. His welfare lies in what is pleasing to his subjects. So it's a very similar sentiment that is being expressed here. Ashoka is connected with the idea of paternalistic kingship. Save munise paja mama. All men are my children is a statement that he makes in separate Rock Edicts 1 and 2. But Kautilya is not far behind, as we shall see. He says, and the second bit is from Kautilya, the Arthashastra says that the king should favor subjects in distress like a father, should look into the affairs of the gods, sects, learned Brahmins, livestock, sacred places, children, the aged, the sick, the distressed, the helpless, and women, should give gifts, maintain those without relations, and discipline slaves. So the idea of paternalistic kingship is not only there in Ashok's edicts, it is also there in the Arthashastra. What about non-violence? We noted that there is a difference in emphasis. According to Ashok, the attitude towards all living beings that we should all have is one of daya or compassion, gentleness, sanyama or control, abstention from injuring, avihimsa, and abstention from killing, analambha. This I already mentioned earlier. But Kautilya also talks about ahimsa. He talks about ahimsa, satya, shaucha, anasuya, anrishamsya, that very important word, so important in the Mahabharata, kshama. And he says that these things are part of samanya dharma. And he also says that the Rajarshi, the sage-like king, should avoid himsa. So they seem to be agreeing with each other. They're saying that ahimsa is desirable. What about conciliation and the use of force? Well, for Ashok, the focus is definitely on conciliation and exhortation, convincing his people about what Dhamma is, convincing them to follow Dhamma. But he also has a warning in that 13th Rock Edict, which talks about Dhamma Vijaya, which talks about so movingly about the horrible casualties and the death and destruction and the suffering that war creates. That very inscription creates a warning to the forest people that he will not tolerate any disturbance or problem that they might create. The Atavikas, the forest people, he threatens force there. Kautilya also talks about conciliation. He talks about how mantra shakti, that is the power of counsel, consultation, is more, it's a better way of getting what you want compared to Prabhu Shakti, that is the power of lordship, that is military might, and Utsaha Shakti, the power of energy. So there's this idea of the three Shaktis that the king has, and he says that the Mantra Shakti is superior to Prabhu Shakti and Utsaha Shakti. Many of you will know about the 4 upayas or the 4 expedients, Sama, Dana, Danda, Bheda. Sama is conciliation, Dana is generosity. In the political context, it can be bribery. Danda is force, Bheda is creating dissension. And out of all these upayas, surprisingly, or maybe not so surprisingly, because I think Kautilya is a victim of his own notoriety. If you read the text carefully, you find there are lots of, something different is going on here. And he says that the king should resort to force, danda, only when the other upayas have failed. So he's talking about force as a last resort. And he warns against the excessive use of force, unnecessary use of force. And like Ashok, he sees the Atavikas, the forest people, as a political problem, but he also sees them as an important military resource. Coming to punishment, Ashok, as we've noted, talked about the importance of samatha, or let us translate it as fairness, as far as the word samatha is concerned. Kautilya also talks about how justice that is meted out by the king and the officers of the king must be fair. And he says that a king who metes out unjust punishment goes to hell. So both have the emphasis on fairness. And interestingly, both of them talk about a periodic release of prisoners. Ashok claims to have done it many times, and Kautilya advocates a periodic release of prisoners on the king's birthday and other such, on various auspicious occasions. Capital punishment. We know from the 4th Pillar Edict that Ashok granted a 3-day respite to those accused of capital crimes, and that shows that Ashok did not abolish the death penalty. And the Arthashastra has plenty about capital punishment. In fact, it has a typology of death as a punishment, talks about simple death, which is called Shuddha Vadha, and death by torture, Chitra Vadha. So both are talking about capital punishment. What about that really important aspect of Ashok, his concern, his love for animals? We've already seen how he advocates non-violence towards all living beings, humans and animals. And many of his inscriptions, many of Ashok's inscriptions elaborate on his solicitude for animals. For instance, there is Rock Edict 1, which talks about his attempts to curb violence towards animals in sacrifices, in festive gatherings known as samajas, in the royal kitchen. There are other inscriptions that also talk about how the king thinks that his promotion of Dhamma has led to the spread of an attitude of care towards animals, a mitigation in as far as the injury and killing of animals is concerned. So there is plenty on non-violence towards animals, and I don't need to go into all the inscriptions. I think here Ashok's reputation is well founded. He talks about not only avoiding injuring and killing animals in various contexts, he also announces various welfare measures for animals, including medical treatment. He says medical treatment, planting of herbs, root plants, fruit trees, digging of wells, etc. These are not only for humans, they're also for animals. The most famous inscription of Ashok, which talks about animals, is Pillar Edict 5, which lists a large number of animals that were not to be killed. It declares a ban on killing female goats, ewes, and sows who are pregnant or lactating, and as well as a ban on killing young animals less than 6 months old. So, a ban on killing various animals, pregnant females, small, animals who are very young, ban on killing them. And then there are all kinds of other bans that he puts in place. And they amount to a kind of calendrical regulation of injury towards animals or killing of animals, not a complete elimination of killing. So on certain days, that inscription, Pillar Edict 5, says the animals that were hunted in the elephant forest are not to be killed. On certain days, there's a ban on killing and selling fish in the fishermen's preserves. On certain days, there is an injunction an order that husk containing living animals was not to be burnt. On certain days, forests should not be burnt needlessly or in order to kill living beings. On certain days, no animal should be fed with another animal. So very, very detailed. Some of them strike us as a bit odd, but he obviously had something very clear in mind. Cocks are not to be castrated at any time. Bulls, goats, rams, and boars are not to be castrated on certain specific days, and I calculated the number of days it amounted to. And he said that on certain days, the branding of horses and bulls was not to be done. So there's a very elaborate kind of set of statements about avoiding injuring animals, avoiding killing them, positive measures taken for their welfare. What is perhaps not as well recognized is that Kautilya actually has a pretty impressive set of statements about animal protection as well. He should establish on its border of the sanitized game park, which is another issue which I will not go into, or on suitable land, another animal park where all animals are guests. Now, what you have here is the idea of the animal sanctuary, and the word Abhaya Vana is used elsewhere in the Artha Shastra. And we are told that in these animal sanctuaries, in the Abhaya Vanas, should be a ban on, or there should be a fine. Kautilya loves imposing fines. So that's perfectly in line with the primacy of Artha. So fines are to be imposed on those harming animals in the animal sanctuaries. And there's so much more on the protection of animals in the Artha Shastra. You wouldn't believe that this was Kautilya speaking, how horses and elephants under state care must be taken care of when they grow old. For instance, the horses incapacitated by war, disease, or old age, they should be taken care of, so on and so forth. And he talks about how fines should be imposed on those who do not take proper care of state elephants, including those who hit an elephant in an improper place. So plenty of injunctions in the Arthashastra which refer to how animals should not be hurt, how their interests must be safeguarded, how vets should take care of elephants who are suffering from the result of a long journey, disease, or work. Hurting domesticated animals is a punishable offense, according to Kautilya. And if a driver of a bullock cart injures animals on account of a broken nose string or yoke, slap a fine on him. That's what Kautilya suggests. He's very into slapping fines for all kinds of offenses, and fines are prescribed for all kinds of other offenses that involve animals and harming animals. And, for instance, pregnant females or those with young are singled out for special consideration. So if you make a list of Ashok's welfare measures for animals on one side, and on the other side you put Kautilya's recommendations, they are all recommendations for the protection of animals, Kautilya doesn't come across too badly or too poorly at all. In fact, you might say that he does even better than Ashok when it comes to injunctions about animal welfare. Now, where does all this lead to? I'm going to come to now the conclusions, because I've talked about convergence, I've talked about divergence. Now we have to make sense of the convergence and the divergence and see how to reconcile the two things. I think we would agree that Ashoka and Kautilya were powerful political thinkers and innovators with very different political perspectives. And how we can make sense of the convergence to some extent is that although they were separated from each other by several centuries, they were part of a dialogic and shared political tradition. And this is very important because we often look at ancient Indian texts in isolation and we forget that they were part of an interdisciplinary intellectual tradition, and they were part of a tradition. That is, there is much that came before them that they're drawing on to some extent, and that they're also making significant departures from. So I'm not saying that Ashoka and Kautilya have the same ideas, no. But they are part of, or they're recipients, or they're aware of many ideas that were circulating in political discourse across several centuries. Looking beyond the image, what do we see? Do these figures look the same as when we looked at them initially? Well, we see that Ashoka was a strong and passionate votary of nonviolence, but he was not an absolute pacifist. That is fairly obvious. That is well known. What about Kautilya? Does a close reading of the Arthashastra dispel any elements in that image that he has acquired? Well, he is certainly not a strong votary of nonviolence, although there are references to nonviolence in the Arthashastra. Kautilya was not a strong votary of nonviolence, but he was also not a votary of the wanton violence of the state. He recommends the use of judicious and carefully calibrated force required for the king to maintain and enhance his political power. So his king is a thinker. He is a man who makes calculations. He weighs the profit and loss. He engages in whatever force is necessary to maintain and enhance his power, but unnecessary or excessive force, Kautilya points out, is counterproductive and it is dangerous for the king. In fact, he has this very interesting idea of the anger of the people, the prakriti kopa. If the king unjustly overtaxes his people or is unjust to them, then the prakritis, in this case the subjects, can turn against him. So he's aware of the dangers of excessive force. Their emphasis and attitude towards non-violence was different. Ashok's was a powerful statement against violence in general and war in particular. He seriously sought to mitigate violence in the social and political spheres. The only caveat is that the state reserved the right to use force against recalcitrant forest tribes. In the Arthashastra, the references to non-violence are there, but they do not run deep. All force and killing that is calculated as necessary for the maintenance and enhancement of the king's power is legitimate and desirable. Not only legitimate, it is desirable. The non-violence that is mentioned in Ashok's inscriptions and Kautilya's Arthashastra was rooted in very different rationale. For Ashok, injuring animals and humans is to be avoided because injuring life leads to sin, to papa, and demerit, apunya. It is not conducive to the attainment of Swarga or heaven. For Kautilya, when he does talk about non-violence and the desirability of non-violence, human life is graded. It has graded value according to Varna. And the value of animals, to a large extent, lies in their being an important economic resource and a political resource for the state. So he has private property and the state in mind. And finally, we come back to the beginning, Dharma and Artha perspectives on violence and non-violence. Is there a Dharma perspective on politics, on violence? Well, I would say there is internal diversity because the meaning of Dharma also varies in different texts and in different traditions. But one of the points on which the exponents of what I'm calling, for the sake of convenience, the Dharma view of politics, there does seem to be more or less of a consensus that some amount of violence is inevitable in the political domain. So Dharma and Artha perspectives are qualitatively different, but they do intersect. And Ashoka and Kautilya illustrate this beautifully. Ashoka, on the one hand, recognized the pragmatic limits of non-violence in the political sphere, and Kautilya recognized the pragmatic limits of violence in the political sphere. And this is how you get that intersection, in spite of the fact that there is an overall, a significant difference in the ethos, in the presuppositions, in the emphasis on non-violence that we see in Ashoka and Kautilya. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Singh, for this very thought-provoking presentation and raising so many questions. There are many takeaways of this talk, from this talk. And I think there will be a lot of questions among the students also. And I'm so glad that you made this point that ancient Indian texts should not be read in isolation. This is a problem that we face when we go to the larger sphere and people ask us, in this text, it is there. Then, but what happens? What is the context? We have to also largely, as a practitioner of history, we have to look at the context also. So this is, I think, this is for the students. It's very important to note that we cannot read one source without looking at other things. The other is the way she actually gelled that there is a spectrum, and in the one end of the spectrum, it's the materiality, the other end is the morality of the two political thinkers, and how then they are intersecting with each other in different spheres. And it's so well structured, as always. So now it's open to questions, and maybe volunteers can help me in taking up the questions. So just raise your hand. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. I am Siddhi and I am from Political Science Department. My question is, could you please throw light on why did Ashoka emphasize so much on the reserve of violence against the forest dwellers rather than the ones against external attacks? Thank you, ma'am.
Okay, good question. Very good question. By the time the Mauryan Empire was created, the Achaemenid Empire of Persia and Alexander's empire had faded away, and there were a series of Hellenistic kings who had replaced Alexander, and there was a peace treaty between Chandragupta Maurya and Seleucus, and that northwestern border issue seems to have been more or less settled. He does not seem to be concerned about any attacks from the northwest, and he talks about the neighboring kingdoms in the south, the Cholas, the Kerala Puttas, Satya Puttas, but he doesn't see them as a political threat. But the forest people are mentioned, and we should not be surprised by that, because I've always felt that the forest tribes are the single most underestimated element in ancient Indian political history. The reason why we underestimate them is that they did not produce texts. So we only know about them through the texts and, in this case, inscriptions of others. But there were perennial challenges to states and empires that were posed by forest tribes. And that's why even a peace-loving king like Ashok, in that inscription where he talks so feelingly about non-violence and how he is renouncing war, suddenly the tone changes when he talks about the Atavikas and gives them a stern warning. So it's pointing to the very, very potent, strong political threat posed by forest tribes living within the king's empire. And it's not only Ashok. I mean, this is an important factor across the centuries.
I'm Rajat from Political Science Department. Thank you, ma'am, for that lecture. My question was, when you said that Artha view sees human life in a graded value, like it depends on your Varna what the value of your life is. So, is that specific kind of understanding of human life not embedded in a specific view of Dharma itself? So, should we see it as a juxtaposition between Artha and Dharma, or two different kind of understanding of Dharma itself?
Thank you so much, ma'am. Yeah, I'm Pawan. I'm from School of Economics. So, ma'am, my question is, so you talked about Kautilya, right? And his approach is in a way Brahminical, but he's ready to recruit Kshudras in military for economic profits. So, in a way, his actions are inclusive, and his intentions are debatable, and actions are the only real things that do happen. So, ma'am, can we say, like, by purely looking upon their actions, can we say that he's actually the one who follows Dhamma all the time, irrespective of the intentions?
Okay.
Yeah. Because intentions are always debatable. That's always goes in mind. Actions are the one which actually makes certain change.
Hello, ma'am. Thank you. I am Kuldeep Jangir from MA History. So, ma'am, you talk about Kautilya's statecraft and Ashoka way of governance. Although we have very similarly and some differences, but what Ashoka's statecraft is very unique in the way of non-violence and the way of Dhamma. Why we cannot see in the head of time even the Kautilya's and many other empires कि this Dhamma timeline did not followed by any other empire or a special ruler till we have the example of Akbar in the later 15th century time. So why this the uniqueness of Ashoka is remained isolated with this time?
So Varna is embedded in the Dharma Shastra view of Dharma, very much so. It is central to it. But it's not part of Ashok's Dhamma. He doesn't mention Varna at all. He does mention Brahmins and Shramans, but he does not mention Varna. As far as intentions go, for Kautilya, he very clearly indicates what the goals are. Okay? He talks about how the aim of the Artha Shastra itself is to explain to kings how to acquire and protect the earth. Prithivyaha labha palanopayah. Okay, that is how he defines Artha Shastra. And for him, the goal is clear. Let me not say intention. The goal is clear. Intention is not really an issue. What is the issue is that if a ruler is presented with various alternative courses of action, how does he decide on which action is in his best interest? Okay, so it is interest, goal, not intention is not so much the issue there. Now the third question, okay, why is this Dhamma idea not picked up and followed, and why is it that we have these I won't say that Akbar's ideas are akin to Ashok's, okay? But what you're talking about, I think, is that we have certain rulers in Indian history who come up with ideas that seem rather pleasing to us living in troubled times. And why is it that there weren't more of them? That's a very difficult question to answer. I think what comes across most strongly to me when I'm looking at Ashok's inscriptions is that they have a very idiosyncratic ring. We are looking at somebody who had very, very strong convictions that went beyond his immediate political role and political interests. So I think this is really where the personality of individuals comes into play, because there's nothing much to be gained, is there, by spending your whole life, what a thankless task, trying to make people good. What do you get out of it? I mean, you wouldn't, and could you even succeed? So I think he had an impossible dream, and perhaps the rulers in history who have had impossible dreams are of this kind. Okay? They may have impossible dreams regarding conquest and the grabbing of power, in which they will do anything for. But he was a dreamer, I think. That explains why he comes up with all this.
Thank you, ma'am, for that lecture, for that excellent lecture. I'm Debankita. I'm doing PhD in history under Professor Suchandra Ghosh. Ma'am, I wanted to know, can we safely assume the aspect of emotion impacting the way Ashoka and both Arthashastra talking about this, their political strategies, and they depicted their political thinking? I mean, when you say that Kautilya wrote that the vulnerability of kings, that they can be assassinated. I mean, there I felt Kautilya strongly felt about the kings and the whole treatise of Arthashastra. I mean, since he felt strongly about the kings and their courtly life and etc. So, how far emotion had affected these thinkings and strategies, and also this Kautilya commodified animals on one hand, and talking about making sanctuary park on the other. So, I wanted to know if there were conditions back then that led to these legal changes over time, or was it happening simultaneously? Context of the text. So, thank you, ma'am.
Hello. Ma'am, good afternoon. First of all, thank you for your wonderful lecture. There's no better day than today to have your lecture to attend. Ma'am, my question is again about the non-violence thing, about Ashoka's non-violence. It's not that, this concept of non-violence did not exist before, Ashoka realized it, after the war of Kalinga. It existed before that realization also. So, do you think that, this certain kind of, violence are necessary for the kings or the political rulers, to have that moment of epiphany, or to have that realization, that we need peace and not violence? And it is, ma'am, relevant in today's, world, today's, political thoughts also, that until unless there are, violence going on, people don't realize the importance of violence, don't realize the importance of, peace. So
thank you, Professor, for that very enlightening
ma'am.
lecture. So I have two connected questions, both to do with King Ashoka. The first is, it seems that none of the edicts coming from Ashoka have been ascribed to Buddha himself. It seems like he is this independent thinker, like Buddha, so none of it is like being linked back to Buddha. And the second is, like, even though he mentions violence should not be conducted against any living beings. There doesn't seem to be any mention of gender violence. So was that a period of no gender violence?
Another set of very interesting questions. You know, I think the history of emotions is a very important and neglected area within ancient Indian history. And if you look at the political treatises, they do actually recognize emotions as an important part, for instance, of the royal household. And if you look not only at, if you look beyond the texts I've been talking about, at Sanskrit Kavya, at Kalidas, how they talk about the political domain, the emotions do play an important role. Even within the courtly circles, loyalty, creating the king being able to create loyalty, ideas related to friendship, to affection, these are actually talked about in the political sphere. But there is also a very important trend in Indian political thought, and this is not only in political thought, in the Indian philosophical traditions, which sees mastery of the emotions, mastery over the emotions as necessary to attain whatever goal, whether it is to attain Nibbana or Moksha or whatever. But the symbol, the figure of the Rajarshi, who is Raja and a Rishi, self-control, Vinaya, discipline. This is very strong in the Arthashastra. It's also there in Sanskrit Kavya. So the emotions are there, and then conquest of the emotions in order to rule effectively. That is something that is there. You know, the Arthashastra talks about all kinds of things, and we should not think it is describing things that are actually happening. It is describing a potential state. It is a brilliant imagining of a potential, omnipotent, you could call it an ancient communist state. I mean, thank God such a state doesn't exist. The kind of levels of surveillance that the Arthashastra talks about would really make us very, very uncomfortable. So it is really a normative state. So he has these ideas about the commodification of everything, maximizing of profit, not only from prisoners, but from forest people, and in this case, the body parts of animals. This violence and non-violence have existed. I mean, violence has existed, I think, throughout human history. Okay? It is not something new. The 6th century BCE, when we associate it with Mahavir and the Buddha, I think it's very clear that the religions of non-violence came to the fore at a time that was marked by extreme and pervasive violence. And I'm talking about warfare, the 16 Mahajanapadas, all those terrible bloody wars that we read about and whose details we have to memorize when we're in school, and the rise of Magad. What is it? It's extreme violence, pervasive violence. And the fact that two thinkers, among many, by the way, they're not the only ones, renunciation becomes a major issue in the 6th century BC. Non-violence becomes a major issue, not only a moral issue, but then also a political issue. And it remains as such for centuries. It's not only there in the edicts, it's not only there in Kautilya's Arthashastra. I think the text that talks about the problems of non-violence in the political sphere, the text that talks about it in most detail is the Mahabharata. So this becomes a central issue and stays a central issue for many, many, many centuries. Going back to before Ashok's time, starting from before Ashok's time. Ashok, I think very clearly was very closely associated with Buddhism. He talks about it. He talks about how his faith in the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha is very, very deep. And he talks about his close connection with the Buddhist Sangha. So there's no denying his connection with the Buddhist Sangha. And we know that in Buddhism, as also in Jainism, non-violence is very, very important. Jainism, in fact, has a much more extreme approach, radical approach towards non-violence. But I think his commitment to non-violence came from his commitment to Buddhism. But he's not citing the Buddha on this. He speaks as though he is a prophet. He is a very, very self-opinionated emperor. So he may have drawn inspiration from the Buddha's teaching. He does mention some Buddhist text that he wants some texts that he wants monks and nuns to read, but he is making pronouncements as though they are his pronouncements. So he is claiming this Dhamma idea, concept as his own, even though he may have got some of the inspiration, not entirely so. There is some overlap between his Dhamma and the Buddha's teaching for the laity, but there are none of the technical terms in Buddhism, early Buddhism, are there in Ashok's edicts. He's molding it into something new, into his own innovative creation, and that's how he is presenting it. Gender violence has always existed, and maybe he just was not particularly interested in it, I guess. that is the way I would. He didn't see it as a pressing issue. Being a man, maybe he didn't see it as a pressing issue.
Ma'am, this is Nilanjan from Political Science. Ma'am, do you think that the divergences between Kautilya and Ashoka, does it matter from the locations from where they are speaking? Because Ashoka is a king, the absolute authority in the state, and he is addressing the people, the subjects. And as a head of the state, his concern is more about synthesizing the differences of the state. Whereas Kautilya, if it seems that he is a minister or an advisor to the king, so he's addressing the king who needs to know the statecraft. So these locations and to whom they're addressing, does it creating these some divergences?
Thank you, ma'am, for such an interesting comparison. I am Vishnupriya from Political Science Department. Yeah. So my question is, when you were drawing convergences between Ashoka and Kautilya in terms of state and conciliation, so was there any differences when they were kind of in terms of punishment also in convicting the criminals? Were they making criminals accountable to the state, or it's accountable to the society or people as such? Yeah, thank you.
Good afternoon, ma'am. I am Pallav Tyagi from Political Science. Generally, in history, we see that after Ashoka, Mauryan Empire disintegrated very fast. And in traditional history books, that is NCRT, Ashoka is actually blamed for it, that his non-violent policies kind of stagnated the army. And so I want to ask how true it is, and if not, what resulted in so fast disintegration of Mauryan Empire.
Thank you for the illuminating lecture, ma'am. Ma'am, I wanted to know whether there is a historiography regarding the places where the Arth Shastra was composed. And one more thing, after the partition of the Indian subcontinent post 1947, are there serious historiographical issues? Because Pakistan and Bangladesh, they are gone.
Are there serious historiographical debates?
Yes.
About the Arthashastra?
Yes.
Okay.
No, I wanted to know if there is any historiography regarding the place of composition of Arthashastra.
Okay. All right. So the first question, absolutely very important. And you can ask very legitimately that why am I comparing, or should I be comparing a political treatise with a set of inscriptions which are representing the pronouncements of a king? And it would be fair to ask that question. Yes, the location is different, right? The king he's an emperor, and he is having his words inscribed on stone. Most of his subjects would not have been able to read them, so he is not directly talking to his subjects, but there was a very elaborate machinery that was set up for the oral propagation of the Dhamma message, which included Ashoka himself going on padyatras, what we would call padyatras today. So the oral dissemination was more effective than the written text. And in fact, that is something that is important to mention. So yes, they are different from that point of view. But I think that the Chanakya Kautilya issue is different. So the author of the Arthashastra these days is not considered to be the right-hand man of Chandragupta Maurya. Okay, that is the traditional view which most historians do not accept today. But what we can say is that the author was a learned political theorist He was a Brahmin. He had a good understanding of the intersection between political ideas and practice. So in that sense, their locations are different, and we need to keep that in mind when we are comparing their ideas. Quite right. At the same time, I still think that it is a legitimate exercise to compare the ideas because they are often seen as such representing such contrasting perspectives. The question on there was a question on legitimation. Was there a question on legitimation? Yes. So, the standard way in which Ashok's inscriptions and his Dhamma has been understood by most Indian historians is to see it as an attempt to legitimize his power and to create a certain common ideology to weld his empire together. In my view, legitimation is an important part of politics, of all states, all empires. But I think that in the emphasis on legitimation, perhaps historians have been a little, let's say, inattentive to examining the actual content of the ideas that are expressed in Ashok's inscriptions. He is talking not only about political power, he is talking about goodness, about virtue, about something that all of us want, I think, happiness. That is all part of his political discourse. So it may well be a legitimizing kind of strategy, but I think the way in which a ruler legitimizes his power, the content of that strategy is very important. I think criminals, there's a much more detailed, this is where the asymmetry comes into play. The Arthashastra has so much more on crime and punishment than the fleeting references in Ashok's inscriptions. So it becomes very difficult to make any comparison. Did Ashok's pacifist policy lead to the fall of the Mauryan Empire soon after that? Well, he did not disband the army. There is no evidence of that. But I do think that if you want to keep an army strong, you need military campaigns. So it's very likely that the army may have got a bit rusty with this peace-loving emperor and no military campaigns. And therefore, that the military backbone of the state and of the empire, in my view, would have been weakened. Where was the Arthashastra composed? Now, if you had asked me that question about any other text, I would have said, I have no idea. Or somewhere in North India, somewhere in South India. But for the Arthashastra, we actually do know which part of India it was composed in. And that is because the text shows great familiarity with the western coast and gives various, makes statements about rainfall in various months. So we know that the author was probably located somewhere in Western India, somewhere around Ujjayini perhaps, or Ujjain. So we do know that. But after answering all those questions, I must say that I'm really happy that there's so many political science students here today. Not only history students, of course, I'm happy to see in an audience, but it's really a pleasure to see students from other disciplines in the audience as well. And thank you for those wonderful questions.
Thank you very much, the students, for asking those questions. And actually here in the political science department, Arthashastra, Ashoka, these are all taught by the legendary professors. So you can imagine that's why you have this. Now it is the pleasant task to propose a vote of thanks. And I request my youngest colleague from the Department of History, Dr. Vijaya Ramdas Mandala, to propose the vote of thanks.
Okay, thank you, Professor Suchandra. Dear friends, this is a formal vote of thanks for Professor Upinder Singh, but also on the behalf of the Golden Jubilee Distinguished Lecture Series organized by the School of Social Sciences. First, thank you, Professor Upinder, ma'am, for speaking on the, for this Golden Jubilee Distinguished Lecture Series on Ashoka and Kautilya, Dhamma and Artha perspectives of the problem of violence. Something of the environmental and animal things also came to the fore when you were speaking about Dhamma and Artha Shastra. We enjoyed your illuminating and thought-provoking lecture. We greatly appreciate your knowledge and expertise. Today's Golden Jubilee Distinguished Lecture remains valuable to the audience, students as well as some of the faculty, mainly students, but also future academic aspirants. I'm confident that Professor Upinder Singh's insights are taken with passion. They will inspire further research not only on early India concerning violence and non-violence of Dhamma and Artha from the prism of Ashoka and Kautilya, but also can be applicable to contemporary politics and Indian society. Now coming to an immense gratitude goes to Professor Jyotirmaya Sharma, our Dean of the School of Social Sciences, for creating a vibrant intellectual platform through the chain of distinguished speakers. It is very, immense crowd here. I couldn't find a seat, so there was one seat reserved for the faculty. So please give an applause to Professor Jyotirmaya Sharma. Thank you so much, sir. This is very, very, very vibrant intellectual environment I could see. Now, thanks to Professor Suchandra ma'am for coordinating, bringing Upinder Singh in coordination with the Dean. Further, good events like this would only be possible with a generous support from the Institute of Eminence. Our Institute of Eminence, which was given by Government of India to us, now benefiting, mainly the students, not just the faculty. So we should thank our Vice Chancellor, but also the IOE. But also a tone of thanks to the volunteers for providing logistic support. I could see these flyers. There is a lot of hard work going behind, preparation of all this. So give an applause to them. So thank you so much. A final word is, let us keep this momentum going. Working together, we can achieve great things. Thank you, ma'am. It's a very wonderful lecture. After Romila Thapar, I think this is the very brilliant lecture I listened to on ancient India. Thank you so much. Thank you all. Thank you.